was 5 years old, I was a little bit different than most kids. You see, most kids my age wanted to grow up to become a successful actor, or a famous astronaut, or a professional athlete. Whereas I had far more realistic goals. I just wanted to be a lawyer, or a preacher, or the Red Power Ranger. Okay, so maybe that last one's not incredibly realistic. But nevertheless, growing up for me was a little bit different of an experience than it is for most people. You see, I live and go to school in a little town called Gilbert. It's about 45 minutes north of Des Moines. And the issue for me growing up was that I was, and still am, one of the only people of my faith who go to my school. In fact, the only other person in my entire high school who is Muslim is my older sister. And the issue for me growing up was that I never had anyone who I could look up to, no community leaders who I could turn to. And so I dreamt big. However, I decided that what I needed to do was to see how I could change the world, how much of a difference I could make, so that way I could be the role model that I never had when I was growing up. Of course, life doesn't always work out the way you expect it to. Following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, things changed. Now, in my community, things were, for the most part, normal. My teachers still taught me, my friends were still my friends, and there weren't really any overt changes. But something shifted covertly that day, and I found out about it a little later on. Now, I didn't find out about what happened for a few years afterward. My parents were wary to explain it to me, and understandably so. Besides the fact that it's difficult to explain something of that much magnitude and significance to someone who was only 6 when the attacks occurred, they were afraid that I would have a little bit of an identity crisis. The idea that people of my faith attacked my country would make me feel like I could only be Muslim or American, when in reality, I can be both. And when they told me, indeed, they were right, I was confused. I didn't understand how anyone of any faith could do such a thing. However, after thinking about it for quite a while, what I realized was what those people did was a gross misinterpretation of religion, and that what I had to do was try and overcome that. However, I realized a little later on that some people viewed that not as religious extremism, but as religious representation. It was a day in 7th grade. It was gym class, the most dreaded of all classes. And a classmate who I had never talked to before asked me 2 questions. He asked what my religion was and where I was from. And after I told him the answer to the first question, he responded with, "Go die with Osama." I was stunned. I was confused. I didn't know what to think. Here was someone who I had never talked to before, but immediately their impression of me was based on something I had never associated myself with. And while it was a little bit tough for me that day, it helped me understand something. The change that I had wanted to make when I was 5 years old could be made right here in my own community. It wouldn't be a substantial national or global change like I had wanted to make, but it would be substantial in and of itself. And so I made it my goal to see if I could make that change by trying to become an ambassador for my religion. I was going to try and see if I could explain aspects of my religion to my teachers and to my classmates who wanted to learn more about it. So that way, people could understand that what happened in September 11th was not an example of Islam, but an example of extremism. But things didn't work out exactly as planned. You see, while it worked for the most part, this past year has been a little bit more difficult. For example, take this past February, when CNN came out with an article that talked about how the FBI was infiltrating mosques in Des Moines, of all places. They were gathering intelligence and spying on the community and had been doing so for years, but in Des Moines. And that confused me. You see, I didn't understand how it was that there could be this much tension between these two groups of people, and why it is that simply cooperating with leaders wouldn't accomplish the same goals. I was feeling as though my efforts to be a cultural ambassador of kinds was failing and wasn't making a large enough difference. But the breaking point for me came later on in that month. I was at a debate tournament, and I was talking with one of my friends by the name of Brett. And one of his classmates comes up and immediately asks me what my religion is. And after I told him that I was Muslim, he responded with, "Just make sure you don't blow anything up." I was speechless. He was someone who I had never met, never heard of, and had only said a few words to. And immediately, his response was associating me with terrorism. I had no words to say, and it seemed like all of my efforts to try and bridge understanding, to try and explain myself, were worthless, as if they had made no difference at all. It seemed that me, putting myself out there in a community that was different than me, wasn't working, and that I couldn't overcome people's preconceived notions. But that changed a few minutes later on. My friend Brett, who I was originally talking to, brought over Jacob and asked him to apologize, which he did. And after that, Brett took me to the side and said that he was sorry for what happened, even though he had no part in it. And that's when I realized something. My friendship with Brett had an impact. The fact that I represented who I was via him had made a difference. He saw what it was that I represented and what Islam represented. And that simple thing had changed the way that our friendship worked. I had made a difference just by changing him. You see, people always say that you are strongest when you are around people who are like-minded. Strength in numbers. Well, what I've learned to be true is that sometimes when you put yourself out there in a community that is different than you, that is when you have the most power. Because it only takes a single drop of ink to change the entire color of the water around it. Thank you.